The night the breath ran thin, the city held itself like a prayer. Generators beat their metallic drums along the river road, and the main hospital's oxygen manifold clicked a worried rhythm as numbers fell from green to amber. A gate, ordinary and dented from years of knocks, loomed like a verdict at the entrance to the government motor pool. Behind it, under sodium lamps, waited a convoy, 2 pickups and a flatbed carrying the silver-bellied cylinders that meant another dawn for children with lungs that tightened at nightfall and for old men whose chests rose like bellows in a storm. The keys were with Kader, Ibrahim's driver, a man whose jacket carried the crisp smell of new leather and whose smile had always come a fraction too late, as if it were being cued by a director no one else could see. When the security guard Salif reached for the bolt, Kader's phone answered first. He looked past Salif to the lorries, then at the hospital calling his screen. "There's a form missing," he said, shrugging as if forms were weather. "You know how it is. No ledger, no gate." In a ward across town, the resilient one, Mariam, steadied her son's shoulders as a nurse adjusted tubing around a narrow face the color of clay after rain. The nurse, Aicha, moved like someone in a practiced dance, measuring flow, listening for the faint rasp that told her the machine was feeding life and not simply whispering comfort. A green bar on an aging monitor ticked down. "They promised cylinders at midnight," Aicha said quietly. "Breath is the only bill we pay first in this house." She kept her eyes on the door with the peeling paint, then on the clock, then back to that door, as if watching it would widen it. The hospital director, a man whose pen weighed more than his hands, insisted a new procurement clause had clipped their wings. "No release until accounts reconcile," he'd told her in the afternoon, tapping a circular stamped with the ministry's seal. In that circle, the system found its cover. Ibrahim heard the ward through a phone's trembling speaker. He wasn't a man who filled rooms with declarations. He preferred to move through thresholds like air, quiet as a breath, leaving them wider than he'd found them. He had chosen Kader because Kader once drove a taxi through floods to deliver a grandmother to the civil registry before sunset. People repeated that story like a hymn. Now, in the small hours, Ibrahim stood facing the same motor pool gate where the guard was being told to wait. The ledger's missing line, the one no one could produce, hung between men like a net. Inside the office, a fan sliced the darkness into measured pieces, and an obstructive official sat with a stack of red folders he'd never opened in public. Director Sori of procurement spoke in legalese that bled the urgency from any request. "There are processes," he said over the phone when Ibrahim reached him. "We cannot be seen to break them." Processes, he meant, like 1,000 nails hammered into a door until it would not move. WhatsApp chimed with messages spinning through the city. A parent's voice note thin with fear. A pharmacist posting a blurry photo of the hospital's empty manifold gauge. A union clerk replying with a prayer emoji and a shrug. Everyone blamed the gate. No one pointed at the hands holding it shut. In their silence, a wound revealed itself. Injustice doesn't scream. It compresses the chest and makes the world count breaths. A block away from the pool, Ibrahim's aide, Amadou, arrived with a thermos of mint tea and a notebook that already carried the night's ledger of calls. He listed times, he listed names, he noted Kader's route from the ministry to the motor pool that evening and the odd detour down a street of spare parts and unofficial receipts. "Sir," he whispered, "the cylinders were filled by 4. They should have been on the way by 9. The only door that moved tonight was the wrong one." Kader jangled the keys again, then stilled them. In that moment, Ibrahim watched the man he had chosen stand between life and the lorries like a hinge deciding whether it belonged to the door or the wall. The cold open of the night felt like a trap dressed as bureaucracy. But in Ibrahim's quiet, a choice formed, the kind that doesn't raise its voice. If the ledger was being used as a lock, he would become the breath that moved through it. When he finally spoke, his words carried the simplicity of a rule older than any seal. "Open the gate," he told Salif, not looking at Kader. "We account for breath after we've returned it to the people." The bolt shrieked like something relieved. The flatbed coughed itself awake, headlights touching the walls like a sunrise that had gotten lost. The convoy pulled into the street, and the city's tight chest loosened a little. Aicha would not know the paint was fresh on the cylinders when she snapped the valve. She would hear the soft rush and let her own lungs unclench. But as the lorry set out, Kader's phone lit again. His thumb hovered. In the glass, the outline of a man caught between 2 ledgers, one of duty, one of favors, was conserved like a pressed leaf. What happened next would make the night's drama look like a prologue. Betrayal would step into light not as a shout, but as a receipt. The road to the hospital in the old quarter is a ribbon that loops past sandbagged shops and faded billboards, selling soap as if cleanliness were a religion older than love. The convoy eased through in second gear, and Ibrahim's vehicle took the rear, a habit learned from years of moving as one might in markets, watching the weave. Midway, the street narrowed into a throat. A truck with its hood raised blocked the path, radiator steaming like a tired horse. Men in reflective vests waved apologetically and asked for 5 minutes. A 5-minute pause is how gates disguise themselves when they leave their posts. Amadou checked his watch and wrote nothing. Salif stepped down, his torch tracing faces. Kader leaned out, voice casual, a little too quick. "Perhaps we can swing down the back road past the stadium," he suggested, already tapping into a group chat titled Delivery United, a place where drivers traded routes, fuel prices, and favors. A horn sounded from behind, impatient, and the convoy peeled off down a side street that smelled of diesel and fried dough. On WhatsApp, someone dropped a pin in a sentence without vowels. Shorthand for a meet, shorthand for money. In the cab, Kader's smile sharpened into something brittle. He took a call, muted it, took another. The lorries slowed near a warehouse, with a door that was too new for the neighborhood. A man stepping from its shadow wore an ID lanyard for a company whose vans had been parked outside the ministry lately, white paint still gleaming. He gestured for the flatbed to reverse. "Quick refill check," he said, paperwork pressed to a clipboard. Sori's signature photocopied so many times it had become an icon rather than an ink. The driver of the flatbed hesitated until Kader gave the tiniest nod. Inside the ward, Aisha squeezed Miriam's hand and the child's fingers uncurled like a flower testing morning air. The monitor bar had slid to red while they waited. She had already begun the slow ritual nurses learn when supply runs thin. Oxygen conservation, reposition, pace, whisper hope. Calls ricocheted among administrators about whether the hospital could take delivery without the month's subvention transfer clearing. "Precedent," one said, as if the word were oxygen. In the cafeteria, a woman in a green head wrap, Hawa, the night shift canteen manager and the city's unofficial conscience, stared at the empty cylinders lined like drums against a wall. She sent a voice note to her radio program's producer. "We have turned our wards into counting houses," she said, her voice low as a drum. "Our breath should not queue at an office door." Back at the warehouse, the clerk stamped and stamped, the way a man stamps when stamping is the only power he can exercise without risk. Amadou stepped forward to inspect the cylinders, feeling the raised letters on their bellies. Last refill dates, pressure ranges, serials. 2 had been switched, old for new. Scars on the necks told the truth the paperwork tried to shroud. "We're being played," he said to Ibrahim, barely moving his lips. Ibrahim looked at Kader then, and something there, the flicker of eyes to a third man leaning by the door, made the floor tilt. He could feel the gate again, now in the open air. Not hinges and locks. Favors, invoices, a floating commission that turned a leader's duty into a commodity that could be traded by phone light in a lane behind a stadium. When the convoy finally pulled into the hospital, 2 hours had evaporated from a night that had none to spare. The cylinders were lifted with the reverence of sacred objects. Aisha listened for the hiss and watched the green bar climb back like a tide returning. The child's chest moved easier. Miriam's eyes shone with the particular gratitude of someone who has watched a door open from the inside. Outside, the director emerged with a ledger, flipping pages. He looked vaguely disappointed that the delivery had come without the right counter-signature for his line item. "We'll need to reconcile in the morning," he said, but no one was listening. Ibrahim moved among the porters, his collar dusted with the night, saying thank you as if he were borrowing their endurance. The escalation was not the delay. Delays are as common as dusk. It was the discovery that the gate had learned to move. A system designed to protect public goods had sprouted a shadow limb, nimble and hungry, pulling cylinders like coins from a pocket. Kader avoided Ibrahim's eyes and stood a little too far from the group, rolling his keys between thumb and forefinger, the gesture of a man rehearsing excuses. Amadou copied the serials of the switched tanks into his notebook and circled them hard enough to tear the paper. Sori's name hung in the space like a ghost's breath. In a corner, Hawa whispered to her producer, "Tonight we name doors. We will count them." The city, having gulped air, now waited for what would come when the lamps cooled. Either the quiet return of old habits, or a hand on the hinge that would not be ignored. Before dawn, while prayer lines were being traced and the market sellers arranged vegetables into geometry, Ibrahim returned to the motor pool alone. He walked the fence, counted padlocks that were newer than the rest, noted the wheel tracks that did not match the convoy's tires. He ran his fingers over a sign that listed opening hours, as if breath kept off his time. He chose a piece of chalk from his pocket and wrote 3 words on the gate itself, small but indelible, the way a promise is at first. He would not let the day swallow the night's lessons. The next turn of the key would be different. The driver who plotted would meet a kind of attention that no chord or whisper could deflect. The morning began not with a press conference, but with a table. In Ibrahim's office, which smelled of paper and rain, a battered wooden table became the place where the city's breath would be defended. He asked for no cameras, only the people who actually moved doors. Aicha, in her washed-thin scrub top, Salif with a fresh badge clipped to his shirt, Hawa wearing her green head wrap like a flag from another politics, Amadou with his staccato notes, and, at Ibrahim's insistence, Director Sori, who arrived late and brought his pen like a sword. Kader stood by the wall, eyes on the window, keys quiet for once. Ibrahim placed on the table a hospital cylinder valve, a broken padlock, and a copy of the procurement circular with its impenetrable clauses. Objects carry testimony. He waited for the silence to settle, then spoke a sentence that would become policy by sundown. From this hour, he said, we treat first, we bill later. Breath before billing. The phrase traveled faster than any vehicle. Nurses repeated it to each other like a promise you can hold in your mouth. Hawa pushed it through the radio just after the 9 a.m. market report. Her voice made it sound obvious, which is how you know it is radical. If a gate keeps breath outside, we will remove the gate, she said, letting the words fall like coins on a counter. A WhatsApp flyer appeared by noon with clean typography and a drawing of that cylinder valve, simple as a child's toy. In 3 lines, it explained what changed. Any public facility could draw oxygen and essential supplies without prepayment or transfer confirmation. Reconciliation would occur weekly via a central ledger. Disputes would be argued after lives were stabilized. The old incentives were named and set aside. A clerk somewhere began to shake. While the city repeated the phrase, Ibrahim ordered the first rehearsal. It would be too easy to sign a paper and call it a day. Systems change when ordinary hands learn new muscle memory. He had the convoy return to the motor pool with empty tanks and run the route as a drill. This time the gate opened before the motor's hum touched it. Salif had moved the bolt because a checklist told him to, and the checklist now preceded the ledger. The detour by the warehouse became the test. Would drivers choose it when money was no longer whispering from the shadows? Ibrahim walked behind the lorries, every step a metronome, and watched Kader's shoulders, saw the tension in the man whose private ledger was being erased by sunlight. When a man at a crossroads isn't forced to betray, you learn what he wanted to be. The complaint channel was the unglamorous heart of the intervention. Amadou, who loved clear lines and relentless follow-through, set up a number and plastered it on posters, hospital doors, and the back of the motor pool gate under Ibrahim's chalked words. Report denial, the card said plain. Response in 2 hours. He set the SLA himself and routed calls to a small team with no patience for delay theater. Within hours they logged cases. A clinic in the outskirts told to return tomorrow. A midwife refused sterile gauze until the supplier's cousin signed a form. A jerseyed guard at a small depot insisting his lunch break outranked a referral. The team called, invoked the new rule, and called again. They kept a ledger, not a trap, but a record of how habits change. Ban the perverse incentive, Hawa repeated on air, savoring the words as if tasting a bitter herb that heals. The perverse incentive had been small commissions, shaved-off emergency deliveries, a floating market in misery that made month-ends look better for the wrong people. Ibrahim replaced it with a clear funding path, a direct subvention line from the Treasury into a ring-fenced account audited weekly and displayed in a public dashboard. He previewed the board, door-to-help minutes, denials in last 24 hours, stockouts by facility. 3 lines, 3 truths. When he described it, he said less than he felt. Humility in leadership is not the same as softness. It is steel that refuses spectacle. Kader watched all of this, like a man listening to a language he had learned as a boy and then forgotten for the sake of speed. His phone buzzed with messages from the group chats that had made him useful to those who wanted doors to creak at the right times. "Are you still with us?" one asked. He stared at the words, then at Ibrahim, who was busy listening to a nurse explain how to label replacement parts on oxygen regulators so that they could be repaired instead of replaced. Kader looked down, turned off the phone, and slid it across the table toward Amadou. A small act, a huge hinge. Ibrahim said nothing. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a door opening somewhere he wouldn't need to dramatize. By evening, the reform had moved from words to muscle. Drivers ran the drill again. Aicha drafted a 1-page training guide. How to check a cylinder, how to log a denial, how to invoke the rule when someone in an office waved a form. It was embarrassingly simple, and therefore dangerous to old habits. Hawa closed her show by listing people who held doors for others that day. A porter who refused a tip and opened the passage because the new rule said, breath came first. A cashier who stamped a form after care was given rather than before. A guard who ate his lunch while watching the gate instead of locking it. We are learning to breathe in the open, she said gently. Escalation had met its opposite. Order, but not the brittle kind. The kind that leaves doors ajar and ledgers read aloud. Intervention buys time. Investigation delivers truth. In the week that followed, Amadou's desk became a surface of artifacts, the city's unflattering mirror. GPS logs printed in pale gray showed dots moving off course on delivery nights and cleaving to side streets with lavish shadows. Fuel receipts dated at times a parked vehicle could not have guzzled told their own joke. Gate registers with false neatness, the same flourished signature repeating across entries like a schoolboy practicing forgeries, sat beside phone records where short calls coincided with long delays. The dashboard's door to help line bent downward, but in the background a second line, the hidden network of rents and favors, fought to keep its slope. The team pulled on threads, patient as tailors unpicking a bad seam. Kader sat for a conversation with Amadou that wasn't an interrogation so much as a ledger reconciliation. There is dignity in confession when it is handled not like a trophy, but like a repair. He explained how the scheme worked in sentences that sounded as if he had practiced them in his head for a year. Stops at an inspection warehouse where 2 cylinders in every load were swapped for empties paid for by over-invoicing. A clerk who received 50 for every stamp issued after midnight. A senior official whose signature greased every deviation from route plan and took its cut through a cousin's service company. No names were said at first. Amadou let Kader breathe between sentences. Then the names arrived, not shouted but laid on the desk like culprits tired of standing. Director Sori's photocopied signature had been real often enough to bless the fakes. The system was the gate, but men had learned how to sell its hinges. Hawa's program planned a series they titled Doors. Each night they took one artifact and paired it with a human voice. A mother describing what a red bar on a monitor feels like next to a screen capture of a procurement clause requiring prepayment for emergency items. A guard explaining how he'd been told to delay a night shift because the ledger doesn't wake for breath, alongside a scanned gate log with a gap where a convoy should have been. They avoided accusation as sport. They chose exposure as a kind of care. "We are naming the broken mechanism," Hawa said in her on-air whisper. "We are not burning the house." The audit's center of gravity still sat with Sori. Ibrahim summoned him with courtesy and offered water first, then space to speak. Sori began with speeches: compliance, precedent, risk mitigation. Ibrahim listened the way he always did, eyes on the person, hands quiet. He placed on the table one of the swapped cylinders with its serial sanded to blur, and the warehouse's security camera stills, retrieved by Salif's cousin who repaired electronics for fun. He turned the screen so that Sori could see his own car idling near the back gate on 3 separate nights. He didn't raise his voice. He asked a question that had only one honest answer. "Who told you that gates are sovereign?" Sori's face in that instant appeared relieved, as if he were being allowed to stop pretending. He admitted favors, not theft. He spoke of budgets that arrive late and expectations that arrive early. He named the cousin. He named the lunch. He named the way he rationalized nights under a whirring ceiling fan. Ibrahim did not humiliate him in public. Justice is not a sport. The truth had to be aired, but the airing had to teach more than it punished. The procurement clause that had been used as a weapon was posted on the ministry website with a red line next to the new language that spelled breath before billing in the bureaucracy's own dialect. The warehouse license was revoked. Its bright new door was sealed with an official sticker retrieved from an old cupboard, repurposed for an honest act. The cousin's company was delisted from the vendor registry, its forms archived and linked on the dashboard under retired partners, next to the reason, conflict with the breath protocol. Kader agreed to make a recorded statement for the training. Not a spectacle, a testimony. "This is how it starts," he said into Hawa's microphone. "Someone tells you the ledger is more important than the breath that will write itself into a child's future. You nod once, and then there's a second nod. The gate becomes a habit. The habit becomes a market. The dashboard went live that Friday. It had 3 lines, as promised, and small text that made it human. Average door-to-help minutes were posted by facility, not to shame, but to focus attention. Denials in the last 24 hours displayed a number and a trend arrow. Clicking it opened anonymized case summaries with the exact sentence used to deny and the exact sentence used to reverse. Stockouts by facility listed zeros that felt like applause. At the bottom, a counter ticked complaints resolved in under 2 hours and open cases, tiny lights keeping the city awake without making a show of sleeplessness. The first time the numbers dipped the wrong way for a day, Ibrahim read them out on air himself. "We missed the turn today," he said plainly. "You will see us turn back tomorrow." Authority made humble looks like that. Exposure demands consequence. Traore was suspended pending a formal process. The law's door opened not because someone shouted, but because the latch had been replaced. The warehouse clerk faced charges appropriate to his role, not scapegoated for the bigger game. Kader, after his testimony, was reassigned away from roots to training, where he could steer with his mouth and his scar. Salif received a citation, the kind of small metal that moves culture more than it seems, because it tells guards that watching a gate is a sacred act. The investigation ended not with fireworks, but with a city that knew where its doors were and could name who held each key. And in the hospitals, green bars held their color longer, which is the only metric that matters if you strip the world to its spine. Reform began with a name that could be painted on a wall and explained by a porter without looking over his shoulder. They called it the Breath Before Billing Protocol, BBB for short, because initials slipped faster through crowded rooms. Rule 1 was a sentence that made bureaucrats blink and nurses smile. Treat first, bill later. The second rule outlawed cash at gate, that old disease. Nothing crossed the threshold because a pocket asked it to. Instead, a clear funding path threaded from the Treasury's subvention line into a pooled emergency account that couldn't be dipped by side hands. Transfers were automatic on Fridays, reconciled on Mondays, and logged in a ledger whose black lines were projected every afternoon in the ministry lobby where sunlight made moving numbers look harmless and honest. Training took place on a Tuesday. Under a mango tree behind the motor pool, where shade makes men and women remember their childhoods and listen better, Aicha unrolled a one-page laminated sheet that might have insulted a committee but saved a stranger. It had pictures: the valve, the manifold, a phone screen with the complaint number, a stamp with the word "after" for billing. She demonstrated the dance: receive, record, release. A portly depot manager asked if the old forms were to be burned. Hawa laughed in a way that didn't mock him and said they would be archived and pinned to the wall titled, "What We Survived." Kader told his story without adornment, describing the first time he had paused for a stamp at midnight, thinking he was only being prudent. He did not ask for forgiveness. He offered a map of how gates learned to move inside us. The dashboard's metrics set the rhythm. Door-to-help minutes became a morning ritual. Facility chiefs texted each other when they beat their previous day by 3 minutes, the way neighbors boast about a garden. Denials in the last 24 hours hovered near zero now. On days when one appeared, a flurry of calls followed, not to punish but to loosen a stuck hinge. Stockouts by facility taught supply chain reforms that were more about conversations than contracts. On his radio program, Hawa introduced a boredom of safety segment featuring stories so unremarkable they felt like miracles. A night nurse who found the cylinder cupboard unlocked, not because someone forgot, but because the new rule made locking unnecessary. A junior accountant who bragged that he reconciled after care and slept better for it. A guard who said the only keys he turned that week were for his own house, which made his wife smile. Consequences had their place and arrived without drumbeats. Traore's suspension matured into a prosecution carefully bounded by what had been proven and by a decision not to poison the well with theatrics. His cousin's company dissolved quietly. The men who took small stamps for small bills received fines and were required to attend the Tuesday training, where a cadre of guards taught them a different honor. Salif, whose torch had found shadows when needed, was promoted to oversee all public gates for medical logistics. His first act was to remove a rusted chain that had hung as ornament at a clinic since colonial days, more symbol than barrier. But symbols shape posture. A monthly culture check found its way onto the calendar like a recurring prayer. Ibrahim insisted on sitting in the back during these, sometimes with a child on his knee whose mother was at the front, telling a story about a night when a door opened when it ought to. The checks were not audits with stern faces, but circles where people named what felt heavy and what had lightened. They measured rituals. Did the complaint line ring accurately? Did the voice on the other end say, "How can we remove the gate?" before asking for any number? Did the dashboard's 3 lines invite pride or anxiety? Did anyone slip back into speaking of precedent when breath was the question? The answers were written in a ledger with broad margins for comments because some truths hug the edge. The reform reached beyond oxygen without announcement. Someone in the registry office taped the BBB flyer next to a photo of a newborn, then argued that birth certificates should follow the same logic. Record first, fees later. A school bursar put a jar labeled "Not a Gate" on the counter and sent children away with books and an IOU that the system would settle. A bus inspector stopped levying on-the-spot fines at dawn when everyone was late, because a bridge repair had narrowed the road. He wrote a report instead that detailed the bottleneck like a doctor describing a chest. The perverse incentive, the market that pays people to sit on keys, felt embarrassed to show its face. Ibrahim's intervention never turned into a personality cult, partly because he would not let it, partly because the work refused spectacle. He collected testimonies and built a shelf in the ministry lobby with the letters BBB carved unevenly by Salif on a slow afternoon. Beneath, people taped receipts that didn't dictate care and thanked clerks by name for obeying a rule that could have threatened their small powers. On the gate of the motor pool, the 3 chalked words from that night had been painted over by a sign writer in clean blue. The lettering was straighter than pain, but you could still see the chalk's ghost if you looked in the right light. Reform had chosen a shape, a door that opened outward, a ledger that recorded breath's dominion, a habit that carried itself across sectors on quiet feet. Months turned into something better than triumph, routine. In the hospital, the manifold's needle drifted within its band, and no longer learned the color red as a daily lesson. Aicha memorized new boredom, the kind that allows her to linger over a chart to see a pattern rather than scramble to find the next cylinder. She led drills for interns who had not known the old days, and when she told the story of the night the gate thought it was a judge, they widened their eyes as if hearing a folk tale, not history. Miriam's son chased a ball in the courtyard that used to hold extra beds on surge nights, his breath a bright ribbon. He paused once to look at a poster of the dashboard metrics. To him, the 3 lines were part of the hospital's wallpaper, not a revolution. At the motor pool, Cater kept time with a whistle instead of keys. He supervised 3 new drivers and told them, without sermon, that shortcuts are gates walking in disguise. He had a scar on his hand from a cylinder valve and wore it openly, a small truth you could shake. Sometimes he would stop at the gate with Salif, and they would talk about bolts as if discussing character. "You have to oil them," Salif said, "or they forget their job and try to be scenery." The 2 men ran a monthly drill on a Saturday morning when the city was posting photos of fried dough. Children from the neighborhood gathered to watch the lorries reverse with practiced grace, a choreography that taught them more about citizenship than any lesson in a book. Hawa's radio program shifted its tone without losing its teeth. The Doors series became Hinges, a quieter show where she interviewed people whose work was steady rather than brave. She read out the dashboard's 3 numbers at noon, and if they were ordinary, she celebrated them with the same voice she once used for breaking news. "Today, door to help is 8 minutes at the main facility," she would say. 8 minutes is what competence sounds like when it breathes. Complaints still trickled to the line, and each was answered within the promised 2 hours. She sometimes called a complainant back herself, not to perform diligence, but because she liked to hear relief in a stranger's sigh. In the ministry lobby, the BBB shelf collected dust the way history does, not from neglect, but from lack of crisis. Ibrahim ordered a weekly wipe even so, because neglect is a gate in disguise. He stood below the shelf one Monday as a school delegation toured the building, young faces expecting spectacle and receiving instead a lecture on reconciliation timing and subvention cycles. He smiled when he saw their disappointment evaporate into curiosity. He asked them to read the old procurement clause and the redlined version aloud and to tell him which felt like a door and which felt like air. They answered correctly, and he told them the only secret in governance worth keeping. If you can explain it under a mango tree, you can enforce it. Sori's trial ended with a measured verdict. He was fined, barred from procurement leadership for a decade, and ordered to perform administrative work at a rural clinic 2 days a week for a year. There, he watched a nurse like Aicha log denials that did not come and heard a radio through a thin wall announce door-to-help minutes he now contributed to without signature. He learned, as men do, that humility wears a uniform that fits all sizes. The clerk from the warehouse worked off his penalty by cataloging parts in the central depot, proving that even hands that once held stamps like weapons can learn to count for a better purpose. No one cheered at the announcements. The audience had moved on to the work of staying consistent. The habit spread sideways as good habits do. The registry, which had taped the BBB flyer next to a newborn, built its own 3-line dashboard. Wait to registration minutes. Denials in last 24 hours. Certificates issued with errors corrected. The bus authority tried a version for rush hour. Door to seat time. Fines forgiven due to system delay. Complaints resolved. Other gates, seeing the motor pool gate's blue sign, wanted their own signs not out of envy, but to signal that they belonged to the same quiet revolution. The city lay down subtly different lines of pride. It began to praise the ordinary ledger, not because it lacked drama, but because it kept breath in the foreground. On a late afternoon, when the shadow of the mango tree reached the motor pool fence, Ibrahim walked the perimeter as he had on the morning after the crisis. He ran his palm along the sign writer's neat blue, then stepped back to catch the ghost of his old chalk. He heard laughter from the depot where Kader was teaching a new driver to reverse without using mirrors. He felt the temptation, as all leaders do, to imagine his own indispensable shape. He refused it. He preferred to be mistaken for someone's uncle who shows up on time and carries the lighter end of the table. He measured success by how little anyone had to say about him in the market. The night that began the story was now a lesson used in training rather than a wound that wept. The city still had its share of locks and its quota of men who loved holding keys. But the culture now assumed doors were for passing through, not for perching upon. Breath had reclaimed its place as the first payment estate owes its people. Ledgers, once the excuse, had learned their role as witness. Gates, still metal and still heavy, had been taught humility. The boredom of good systems had settled over the hospitals like cool air. In that steady quiet, a mother somewhere counted her child's breaths with joy, not fear, and a driver somewhere smiled at an open gate without needing to call anyone first. The shock had passed. The habit remained. That is how justice, stripped of spectacle, keeps time. And that's where we leave tonight's chapter. Doors lighter, ledgers honest, breath returning to its rightful place. If this story moved you, carry it forward. If you like the video, then like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your voice helps this work travel, keeps the lights on the dashboards bright, and tells the next gatekeeper that people are watching. Until the next investigation, take care of each other and keep every door worthy of the people it serves.